A hand trap is a term for a card which can be activated from your hand during your opponent's or your own turn. Mainly during your opponent's turn though, with the vast majority of hand traps actually being monster cards and not traps. And hand traps are kind of required in order to play the modern metagame, because of just how game-changing they can be if you're able to resolve their effects. So in this list we'll be going over the best ones of all time. And at number 10 we have Effect Veiler. This is one of the OG original staple hand traps, as it simply has the effect where you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to negate one monster effect until the end of this turn. It can only be used during the main phase, although it can be used during your opponent's turn from your hand, which is still kind of a novelty when the card first came out in 2010. Hand traps weren't super prevalent when Effect Veiler came out, but they did exist. They just didn't get really good until much later on in the game's history. And then once decks started coming out which had ridiculously good first turns, and could win you the game if they weren't stopped from the hand going second, like the wind-up hand loop combos, Effect Veiler started seeing tons of competitive play in order to try to curtail those first turn kill combos. In fact, it became all but required to try to open a hand trap, otherwise you would instantly lose by just having all the cards in your hand discarded to the graveyard before you had a chance to play the game. But opening a single Effect Veiler would have prevented the whole situation from happening. So over the years, being able to negate one monster effect until the end of the turn has always just been kind of good. As Effect Veiler even keeps negating monster effects even if it leaves the field. Like if you use it on one of your opponent's Lone Fire Blossoms or Rescue Rabbit, two cards which remove themselves from the field in order to activate their effects. Those effects will stay negated even though they're no longer on the field. Although Effect Veiler has been kind of power crept, so it's only really seen play in decks that just want to play extra copies of the card which is technically better than Effect Veiler, which happens enough where it still sees play even in the modern era. Effect Veiler is also a level 1 tuner, which situationally makes it useful as a card to bring out on the field if you want to go into Crystron Helki Fibrax combos. Effect Veiler is one of those rare cards that still sees play even after being power crept, and has just seen a whole bunch of play over its history of being in the game for over 10 years, but not as much as some of the higher spots on this list. And at number 9 we have DD Crow. I have DD Crow on here to represent 4 different cards essentially, because we also have Skullmeister, Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, and even Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. All 4 of these hand traps accomplish basically the same thing. If your opponent is activating an effect in the graveyard, chances are one of these 4 cards can stop it. And DD Crow was the first of these cards to be released, coming out in 2007, and being one of the first modern hand traps to see widespread competitive play, being the only card on this list which predates Effect Veiler. And all DD Crow does is allow you to banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard. It can be used whenever you want as long as you have a card in your hand, unlike Effect Veiler which can only be activated during the main phases. So if your opponent's trying to resolve a card, like Monster Reborn for example, you can chain DD Crow to that card in order to remove the target of Monster Reborn from the graveyard, so the effect fizzles out and just goes to the graveyard, wasting that card. You can also use DD Crow to preemptively remove something from your opponent's graveyard so they can't activate it, like an Orcust Harp Horror. But for the most part, you do have time in order to chain DD Crow to the effect, so you don't have to use it preemptively too often. However, cards like Skullmeister, which simply has the effect to negate a card effect which activates in your opponent's graveyard, can be activated in response to pretty much anything your opponent's trying to do in the graveyard. And because of this tiny little distinction, Skullmeister sees more competitive play than DD Crow in the modern era, even though they're both good for basically the same reasons. Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion allows you to negate pretty much any effect that it has to do with the graveyard. If your opponent tries to move a card from the graveyard to their hand or deck or extra deck, or tries to spectral summon a monster from the graveyard, or tries to banish a monster from the graveyard, you can use Ghost Bell in order to shut down any of that. And it's one of the few Ghost Sister hand traps which actually negates the activation of the effect instead of just the effect itself, which means it can be used to proc something like Witch's Strike. The reason Ghost Bell isn't played as much as DD Crow or Skullmeister, even though its effect is clearly superior to both of them, is because its effect is a hard once per turn, whereas Skullmeister and DD Crows are not. So if you draw into multiple copies of Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, you can only use one of them in your hand, whereas you can use all copies of Skullmeister or DD Crow in your hand in the same circumstances. And then Ally of Justice Cycle Reader just has the same effect as DD Crow, except it's able to target 2 cards instead of 1, but only if those targets are exactly light attribute monsters, which means it sees the least amount of play of all the 4 cards, but is definitely better than all 4 of them if you're just trying to counter a light-based deck. And with light being a very popular attribute, this comes up more often than you'd think. With DD Crow being the longest lived card out of all the 4 graveyard disruptors, seen play ever since it came out and still sees play in the modern era, I have to have it a little bit above the other 3, taking the number 9 spot on this list, even if it technically is not as played as much in the modern era as Skullmeister, which was released in 2010, and also has a long history of competitive play, just not as much as DD Crow. And at number 8, we have Droll and Lockbird. This card has a hand effect, where if your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to make it so that for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot add cards from their main deck to their hand. So it doesn't actually stop the first effect, which triggers the effect, it simply applies a lockdown to your opponent for their entire turn, where they can no longer perform any searches, or draw extra cards from their deck, which is actually incredibly good for shutting down combo plays. In fact, it's so good that if you ever play in a traditional format where every card is unbanned, Droll and Lockbird will probably be the only way to stop your opponent from performing a first turn kill, as pretty much all of those combos require tons of drawing or searching in order to accomplish their complicated broken strategies. Which is also why Droll and Lockbird sees the most amount of play whenever there is a ridiculously broken deck in the meta. Back when Spirals were tier 0, Droll and Lockbird shot up to being one of the most played hand traps in the game, but then as soon as Spirals got hit in the ban list to no longer be crazy overpowered, Droll and Lockbird shot down in popularity again. You can kind of see how broken the game is when Droll and Lockbird is being played in droves, and the less Droll and Lockbird sees play, the more healthy the game is to an extent. Droll and Lockbird was also just used as a good way to get rid of every card in your opponent's hand because of how its triggering works. You see, there's this rule in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you can't activate effects if they can't be resolved. So if you have something like Protector of the Sanctuary on the field, which only has the effect where your opponent can't draw cards, then you're not allowed to activate cards like Disturbance Strategy or Trickstar Reincarnation, as both of these cards have effects to get rid of your opponent's hand in order to cause them to draw the same number of cards that they got rid of. With Protector of the Sanctuary on the field, this would be super easy combo to just get rid of every card in your opponent's hand. But with the ruling where you can't actually do that, you just straight up would not be able to activate the effects of those 2 cards. That's where Droll and Lockbird comes in. You see, the trigger for Droll and Lockbird is just your opponent adding a card from their deck to their hand. Although the activation window of this trigger is kind of generous, as it happens after the fact but not during the chain which is doing the search. So, if your opponent searches out a card with Elemental Hero Stratos for example, after they add the card to their hand, you have the trigger available to activate Droll and Lockbird. But what you could do is then just activate Trickstar Reincarnation first, and then chain Droll and Lockbird to Trickstar Reincarnation, which will resolve backwards and applies the effect where your opponent cannot draw any cards. And then Trickstar Reincarnation will banish their entire hand, and then not refill it. Now, there's technically ways to do something similar with Protector of the Sanctuary, but it's much easier to just use Droll and Lockbird combo since it doesn't require any other setup. Just playing an already good hand trap in a deck that could realistically pull off the Trickstar Incarnation combo. And what do you know, Trickstars used to be a competitive deck, and loved to use Trickstar Reincarnation. So this hand trap was basically just a combo tool in order to get rid of every card in your opponent's hand in that deck, and it was really easy to pull off too. In fact, they could kind of pull it off while just doing their plays like normal, and for some reason, none of the cards in this combo ever got banned, just some light limitations on the ban list. And then the power creep of the game got to the point where people weren't really playing Trickstars anymore anyway. And at number 7, we have Artifact Lancia. This card has a hand effect where you can tribute this card from your hand or face up on your side of the field in order to make it so that neither player can banish cards for the rest of the turn. Now, when this card first came out, it did see some competitive play, but only a minor amount. It was kind of one of those lesser known tech cards that people would sometimes use, as the best artifact at the time was Artifact Moral Touch, which was so good it was actually limited on the ban list for a long time. And then when they released Artifact Scythe, it was basically just Artifact Moral Touch and Artifact Scythe that were the only artifacts that saw any competitive play. But then the metagame kind of shifted, and people started playing decks which love to banish cards in order to do their combos like normal. Like the Dinosaur Engine, for example, which basically requires them to banish cards in order to do all of their plays. So against a Dinosaur player, who are able to protect a lot of their effects normally from hand traps because of Miscellaneous Source, you could completely shut down their entire turn with a single Artifact Lancia, which could straight up just win you the game in most cases. And ever since then, there have just been more and more meta decks released that require them to banish cards to use effects, and Artifact Lancia has been a staple of the metagame ever since, to the point where it is now the most played artifact card in the game's history, and people rarely play Artifact Moral Touch or Scythe, which is kind of funny for me because I made a joke skit years ago about how useless the other artifacts were besides Moral Touch and Scythe. Because Artifact Lancia is so good that it's kind of single-handedly kept a handful of meta decks in check, to the point where they can never become tier 1 because Lancia just shuts them down way too easily. And at number 6, we have Infinite Impermanence. This is an actual trap card, which can be activated from the hand if you control no cards on your side of the field. And what it does is negate the effects of one face-up monster until the end of the turn. So basically the same effect as Effect Veiler. Although Infinite Impermanence can be activated at any point, rather than just the main phases, as long as you don't have any cards on your side of the field. Which does give it some more utility over Effect Veiler if you just want to be able to negate the effect whenever and not during one particular phase, even if it is the most common phase where combos happen anyway. Additionally, this card has an extra effect if it's set on the field, where if this card is set and then activated, in addition to the effect of being able to negate the effects of one monster, you also gain the effect where, if you successfully negated the effect of a monster, then you also negate the effects of all spell and trap cards activated in the same column as this card, which means it doubles as spell and trap card negation as well. If you simply set this card in the same column as one of your opponent's spell or traps, then whenever they activate that card, you can just chain Infinite Impermanence to it in order to both negate that spell or trap card and also one of your opponent's monster effects for the turn. Or if you just use it to negate one of your opponent's monster effects, you're going to permanently shut down that column for the rest of the turn. And because it has the dual purpose of both of its effect being good and useful, it's definitely played over Effect Veiler almost every time, if you just need a hand trap in order to negate monster effects. Because it has Effect Veiler's hand trap effect, but it also has an even more useful effect if you set it as a normal trap card. And another niche benefit that Infinite Impermanence has over Effect Veiler is that it's actually a trap card instead of a monster effect. Since most hand traps are monster effects, people will sometimes play monster effect negation cards in order to stop hand traps, like Apollousa, Bo the Goddess, or Amano Iwato, which does nothing against Infinite Impermanence, which can actually be used on both of those cards in order to shut them down so you can use your other hand traps like normal. And at number 5, we have PSY-Framegear Gamma. This card has the effect where, if you control no monsters on your side of the field, and your opponent activates the effect of a monster card, you can then negate the activation and destroy that card, in order to both special summon this card and PSY-Framegear Driver from your hand deck or graveyard. But both itself and the driver are then banished during the end phase if they're still face up on the field. So, in order to use this hand trap, you do have to play a level 6 vanilla Garnet in your deck, although one of the advantages of Gamma over cards like Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler is that it both negates and destroys a monster card, rather than just negating the effects of the card for one turn. And more importantly, it can be used on hand traps. In fact, that's the best way to use this card, because you see, if you use PSY-Framegear Gamma during your opponent's turn, then it's just going to banish itself from the driver during your opponent's end phase, and you won't really be able to make use of the fact that Gamma is a level 2 tuner, and can use driver in order to go into a level 8 synchro monster, like PSY-Frame Lord Omega, or even Borreload Savage Dragon. Although, take for example, you activate a card like Reinforcements of the Army, and your opponent tries to activate Droll and Lockbird to stop you from searching for the rest of the turn. You can then activate PSY-Framegear Gamma in response to Droll and Lockbird in order to negate and destroy the card, which will then special summon itself and driver from your deck, and give you 2 free monsters on the field while also negating one of your opponent's effects. And that's the main benefit of PSY-Framegear Gamma, being able to negate one of your opponent's hand traps during your turn while going +2 in the process, as having 2 monsters on the field is just incredibly useful for pretty much every deck, especially if you can use as materials to go into Crystron Huggy Fibrax, and of course, Borreload Savage Dragon, which has an excellent negate. And with hand traps being so prevalent in pretty much every meta deck, this situation actually comes up a lot more often than you'd think, which is why PSY-Framegear Gamma sees so much competitive play. It's one of the few cards that can negate and destroy while also granting you advantage. Although it is limiting in how you can use the effect, since you can't use it at all if you control a single monster on your side of the field. And at number 4, we have Red Reboot. This is another one of those very rare hand traps that is actually a trap card, and basically has the effect where, if your opponent is activating a trap card, you can negate the activation of that card and then set it face down. Then, your opponent gets to search out and then set one other trap card from their deck. But for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot activate any trap cards. And you can activate this card from your hand by paying half your life points. So technically, the effect doesn't actually get you any advantage at all, as you go -2 in card advantage when you use Red Reboot, as your opponent gets a free search of any trap card from the deck, in addition to the original trap card not actually being destroyed or sent to the graveyard, just set back face down. And even with all the advantage it gives your opponent, you still have to pay half your life points to use it. And Red Reboot is so good that it's kind of overpowered, and limited to 1 copy on the ban list. And the reason for that is because it's a counter trap card. Counter trap cards hold the distinction of being the fastest cards in the game, where if you activate Red Reboot, your opponent can't negate the effect of Red Reboot unless they have another counter trap card. So if your opponent has a full board of monsters with negates, like Borreload Savage Dragon, and they're trying to activate a trap card, you can stop that without fear of any of your opponent's monsters trying to stop Red Reboot, since it's too fast to be responded to. The other thing that makes Red Reboot broken is that it stops your opponent from activating trap cards for an entire turn without any setup. So if you're trying to push for game and your opponent has a full back row of trap cards, none of that matters unless they specifically have a counter trap card which can negate Red Reboot. Otherwise, you're about to shut down your opponent's entire back row for the entire turn, and then just win and ignore whatever resources they get from Red Reboot. Red Reboot is like the modern version of Cold Wave, except a slightly better because it's spell speed 3 and can't be negated easily. And Cold Wave is a banned spell card which just shuts down all of your opponent's spell and trap cards for a turn. Although Cold Wave requires it to be used preemptively, whereas you can just save Red Reboot in your hand until you need it. And it's so good at countering trap decks that it's actually better than cards like Jinzo or Royal Decree, which are 2 cards that negate the effects of all trap cards basically forever. Because generally, you only need to negate your opponent's traps for 1 turn, and Red Reboot doesn't require any setup, and can be used from your hand, and is much harder to negate than Royal Decree or Jinzo. And pretty much any deck which plays a majority of traps fears Red Reboot more than anything, as it's probably the strongest trap deck counter in the game. And if 1 card is able to completely counter 1/3 of the cards in the game, you know it's pretty strong. And the only saving grace is that trap decks are not very prevalent. So Red Reboot is only limited to 1 copy, and it is still an absolute monster at that. And at number 3, we have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This card can be activated when your opponent basically moves a card from their main deck to another location, whether they're adding the card from their deck to their hand, special summon a monster from the deck, or send in a card from the deck to the graveyard. You can use Ash Blossom in order to negate that effect. And because all 3 of those things are some of the most common things you do in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, and in fact, some of those things are some of the best effects in the game, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is almost always live if you have it in your opening hand. And in fact, Ash Blossom is kind of the reason a lot of rogue decks can't compete, because if your deck can't play through a single Ash Blossom, then it's never going to be meta. And what separates a good meta deck from a rogue or casual deck is how they can play through an Ash Blossom on their first turn. And because it's so good against pretty much every single deck in the game, it's also one of the most played hand traps ever, even though it was only released in 2017. And in fact, 2017 is kind of a hallmark year, as that's when a lot of the modern hand traps are released, as post-2017 is kind of the era of hand trap Yu-Gi-Oh!, whereas before they weren't nearly as meta-relevant as they are today. Hand traps absolutely still existed before 2017, and did see lots of competitive play, they just weren't in every single deck like they are now. And why is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring better than cards like Droll and Lockbird, which just straight up stops all searching for the whole turn? Well, because Ash Blossom stops the triggering card. Droll and Lockbird can only be used after an effect has already occurred, and sometimes that's not good enough, if your opponent's deck only needs to search a single time, and the rest of their combos for special summoning from the deck or just sending the cards from the deck to the graveyard, which Droll and Lockbird doesn't lock out. Being able to negate 1 summon from Krishan Hucky Fibrax, or a selective mill from an Armageddon Knight, can win you the game in some cases. Although only in some cases, there have been some formats where Ash Blossom has seen less play, where it's not actually the most played hand trap in the game, just in the top 3. As it's kind of hard to determine which of the top hand traps are actually played more than the others, as I'm pretty sure Effect Veiler might be the most played hand trap in history, simply because it was just around longer. Although the next card on the list definitely gives Ash Blossom a run for its money, in the category of the most played hand trap in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, or at least from the last couple of years. And at number 2, we have Nibiru the Primal Being. This card has the hand trap effect where, during the main phase, if your opponent normal or special summoned 5 or more monsters this turn, you can then tribute all face-up monsters on the field in order to then special summon this card from your hand. Then, special summon a Primal Being token to your opponent's side of the field, whose attack and defense are equal to the combined original attack and defense of all the tributed monsters. And what's notable about Nibiru is the effect can be activated at any point once your opponent has reached the 5 summon threshold. It does not need to be activated immediately as soon as they're at 5 cards. So you can just wait until your opponent is done doing all of their combos in their main phase and is about to enter the battle phase in order to use Nibiru right before they enter the battle phase in order to give them a big rock token. And what makes Nibiru so good is the fact that a lot of monsters don't have any protection from being tributed, especially on a mass scale, which doesn't target anything. Cards like Red Eye's Dark Dragoon can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects, can be very easily removed by Nibiru by having it tributed. And since the token you give to your opponent is basically a vanilla monster with lots of stats, it's very easy to just destroy that with any kind of removal, which is much better than trying to destroy all of your opponents individually, hard to destroy monsters or negates. Basically, resolving a single Nibiru on your opponent can actually win you the game most of the time. And Nibiru is kind of like Ash Blossom, where if a broken deck isn't able to stop Nibiru from tributing their monsters, then they can't compete in the modern meta. And Nibiru is so prevalent in the metagame that it even goes a little bit further, where if you're not able to get a monster negate on the field within your first 5 summons, then you probably aren't going to be able to do anything about Nibiru tributing your entire field. So a deck that's able to get negate on the field as early as possible is much more valuable than the ones that require more than 5 summons to do the same thing. And decks that aren't able to accomplish this, like the hero archetype, are commonly joked in the Yu-Gi-Oh community as ending on a rock token, because they just don't have an innate way to deal with Nibiru completely screwing over their combo plays. And since Nibiru is one of the few hand traps that actually has very high stats, it was able to situationally get over common hand trap counters like Neospace and Aqua Dolphin, who was able to rip hand traps in your opponent's hand that had less than 600 attack. And because Nibiru can basically win you the game if you're able to resolve the effect, it's definitely one of the best hand traps in the history of the game. And it kind of warps the game around itself, where decks are not competitive if they don't have a way to deal with Nibiru and need to special summon more than 5 monsters a turn. Although, even with how strong Nibiru is, it's not actually the strongest hand trap in the game's history, because the number 1 spot is just probably the strongest card in the game, period. And at number 1, we have Maxx. This card has a hand effect where you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to draw a card each time your opponent special summons a monster this turn. This card does have a hard once per turn on its effect, so you can't use multiple Maxx's in order to draw 2 cards every time your opponent summons a card. But there's no trigger on its activation requirement like Droll and Lockbird, so you can use it in response to your opponent performing any special summon in order to draw a card immediately. Now, in order to explain why Maxx is one of the strongest cards in the game, I kind of have to explain what the strongest kinds of effects in the game are, because Maxx's potential is not readily apparent if you just read the card effect like normal. You see, the strongest effect in the game is Victory Dragons, because if the effect resolves, you instantly win the match, which is a best 2 out of 3 duels that you do in competitive events. So it allows you to win another duel without ever having to do that duel, so you get to avoid your opponent's side deck. Since the effect is so strong, the card that is tied to it is currently banned, even if the only legal card which can do the effect is kind of terrible. The second best effects are cards which allow you to win instantly in the current duel, cards like Exodia or Final Countdown. Pretty much all of these have very tough conditions, because simply activating the effects of these cards and resolving them win you the duel. Now, the third most powerful effect is the ability to skip your opponent's turn. If they printed a card in the game which was to simply skip your opponent's turn, but then you lose at the end of that next turn, everybody would play 3 copies of the card in every deck and it would probably be banned for being too overpowered. There's a card in the game called the 6 Shinobi, which is a trap card that can only be activated if you control 6 Samurai monsters with different attributes, in which case you get to skip your opponent's next turn. The activation requirement for this card is crazy difficult to accomplish, because you have to set a trap card in order to gain the effect on your next turn, and of course you need a full board of 6 different kinds of monsters. There's also Arcana Force 21, The World, which has the effect that when it's summoned you get to toss a coin, and if the result is heads, then it gains the effect where during your end phase, you can send 2 monsters you control to the graveyard in order to skip your opponent's next turn. This card is always on the precedent of being overpowered, because if its effect is ever made too easy to accomplish, then pretty much everyone would use it. As it is now though, it's kind of a joke card because it's too hard to actually use reliably. Now, one of the top 10 best effects in the game is to draw cards generically without downsides. Upstart Goblin is limited to 1 copy, and all it does is allow you to draw 1 card at the cost of giving your opponent 1,000 life points. And the reason this card is so good is because it allows you to basically play a smaller deck and cycle through your cards faster. Pot of Greed is banned because it allows you to generically go +1 in card advantage, which is just super good in pretty much every deck, because that +1 in card advantage could bring out a card that allows you to go +5 if you use that card to go into something like Magical Musketeer Maxx, which has the effect to allow you to go +5 in card advantage and only requires a single monster on the field as its materials. There's also super powerful cards which can just win you the game on their own, like Nibiru the Primal Being, Red Reboot, Droll and Lockbird, Evenly Matched, Lightning Storm, or Dark Ruler No More. Very powerful cards that only require a single card from your hand to completely turn the duel around. So, how does this all relate to Maxx? Well, if you chain Maxx to one of your opponent's special summons of a monster, like them summoning a Neospace Connector for example, there's a good chance your opponent will just stop their turn right there. Because they'll know, if you get too much advantage from the activation of Maxx, then no matter what plays they put on the board, they just won't be able to play through the massive amount of advantage you're about to generate. Because there's lots of one-card game changers in the game, and the more cards you draw, the more chances you have at drawing a game changer hand trap which can just stop their plays anyway. Like drawing into a Nibiru, or an Effect Veiler, or a Droll and Lockbird. It is just literally better for them to not play through Maxx, and just end their turn and hope that you don't have another Maxx on your next turn. And the player who used the Maxx doesn't lose any card advantage doing this, because the best way to use Maxx is right when they're about to special summon a monster. So, because of how the metagame works, and because of all the powerful cards you can draw into, and the extra advantage you can get in archetypes with just a single extra card, the activation of Maxx is akin to using the 6 Shinobi and Upstart Goblin all in one, except without any of the downsides of either of those two cards or the crazy activation requirements, as you can just use Maxx whenever. Basically, Maxx allows you to skip your opponent's turn without losing card advantage, and without having any kind of setup. And this is what makes Maxx one of the strongest cards in the game. It's possible to play around Nibiru because you have 5 summons before you have to get a negate on the field. Maxx can be used immediately before your opponent gets a chance to get any monster negates on the field. In fact, unless your opponent has some kind of anti-hand trap support, like Call by the Grave or Crossout Designator, then they just kinda had to skip their turn, or lose to the amount of advantage you're about to generate. So while on surface level, Maxx's effect doesn't seem that overpowered, as all you're doing is drawing a card every time your opponent summons, it's actually so ridiculously good that the card is banned and should probably never be unbanned. Because the entire game would basically be decided by whoever is able to draw Maxx in their opening hand, or if you're able to play a deck that doesn't require you to special summon too many monsters, or it would just kind of create an arms race of playing a whole bunch of anti-hand trap support cards in your main deck. Kinda like what's the case over in the OCG where Maxx is unbanned, and the metagame is completely different because of it. In fact, it's to the point where people don't even play Maxx anymore, because everybody is so afraid of Maxx that all decks are kind of playing around it already by default. So there's no reason to even have it in your deck anymore. Alright, and that's the list. I actually have a 30-minute video going over why Maxx is banned, if you just want a crazy amount of detail about how broken the card is. And as always, suggestions and comments about the video are always appreciated.